Hey guys, in this video we're going to be looking at setting up Gatsby with DatoCMS and building a small site using the two. So the site we're going to be making is based on the Visual Studio Code landing page. It's going to be super simple. We're not actually going to build out the entire page. We're just going to pick some examples of sections on the landing page, and you'll soon find that it gets pretty repetitive. So before we set up any Gatsby and DatoCMS projects, it's a good idea to analyze the design of the Visual Studio Code landing page and try to identify common patterns or elements on this page. So then when we start to model that data in DatoCMS, it becomes a lot easier. So this also holds true for most websites. I usually create most of my websites in this way. So the common thing is always that you have sections of a page. So this top hero section, or I think they call it a Jumbotron in the Visual Studio Code. So the class name is Jumbotron here, but it's a hero section, a top section, element, whatever you want to call it. And it's true for, I'd say, pretty much all websites that there's a pattern here. So we have this section. So a section could be a component. And this section, we can assume that it'll always contain grid columns. So we have the first grid column here, which is set to, I'd say, maybe like 30%. And then the second grid column here showing the screenshot, that will be set to the remaining 70%. So the grid columns equal 100%. So we've got a 30% grid column and a 70% grid column. Usually then we define 3 breakpoints. We'd have a mobile, tablet and desktop view. So obviously we're viewing it on the desktop view now. If we reduce the screen size to a tablet view, for example, it looks like the tablet view then, we're increasing the column size to 100% for both of these columns, and the same will be true for the mobile view as well. So I don't know if that's the approach that Visual Studio Code have taken with their CSS design for their website, and we could easily check the CSS code, but that would be cheating. And to me, this is a lot simpler. If you always think of websites as sections or grids and columns, then it becomes a lot easier to design these landing pages and websites within various content management systems, especially the headless ones, where you're just dealing with data and you're not really dealing with too much visual layout type things within the headless CMS itself. So we can see then we've got our section at the top here. We've got, let's say, 30% column and a 70% column for desktop. For tablet and mobile, it's 100% column widths. So with that said then, let's actually get started with DatoCMS and let's create a new project. So head on over to DatoCMS, sign up, whatever you need to do, log in, and then we're going to hit new project. We're going to create a blank project, and the blank project name, let's just call it Visual Studio Code, create project, and let's head on over to our new project. So at the top here, let's enter our project. And we're presented with our dashboard in DatoCMS. Now, there's 2 different data types in DatoCMS, something called models and something called blocks. Now, models are when you want to create an instance of something. So a good example of this is pages. We want to create instances of pages and be able to link to specific pages, linking to that specific instance of a page. And blocks are very similar to models, but we're not creating standalone instances of them. We're creating almost like embedded instances within a particular model or a particular block. So that probably sounds really confusing. Don't worry, because as we flesh out our data models now, you'll start to see a pattern. Hopefully you'll start to see a pattern, and hopefully you'll know when to use a block or a model. But for now, let's create a model, and we're going to create a page. So we want to create a page model, and it's not a single instance because we can have multiple pages. So we don't want to select the single instance. We can have additional settings here. We're going to skip over the enable draft published system, and we're going to keep everything as default here. That all looks good. So we're going to save our new model. And for a particular page then, we want a bunch of fields associated with a particular page. So if we go back to the Visual Studio Code landing page, what do we want our pages to consist of? Well, first of all, we need a page title. So let's go ahead and add that new field in. We want to add a new field, and in DatoCMS, we can choose a bunch of different field types. So we'll probably go over most of these field types in this video. I want to keep this video short, so maybe not all of them, but I'll try and go over most of the field types that we'll need in this video. But for now, we want a page title. So if you look at all these fields, you can probably guess which one we'd need for a page title, and that's a text field because it's just going to be a string. So let's select the text field. We want it to be a single line string because the page title is almost like a label, right? It's not going to be multiple paragraph of text. It's just going to be a single line string. So we want this page title field to be called title. And we can add a bunch of validations using the validations tab. We want the page title to be required. Ideally, we want it to be unique. So we want the page title to be unique. So for example, this page title field is also going to be the quick identifier when we look at all our page records in DatoCMS. So for example, if we've got a Contact Us page as the page title, but then we've got another page with also the Contact Us page, how do we know which one is the actual Contact Us page? Sure, we could probably click into that page and view the URL and things like that, but it's a lot easier. And also I think it makes sense that a page title is unique because we're not going to want to label, even if we did have two Contact Us pages, we're not going to want to label them both Contact Us. We'd probably want to name them a bit more specific if we did have two Contact Us pages. So let's set this as a unique field. And I'm going to quickly mention, these are just suggestions. If you don't want this to be a unique field, that's fine. If you can think of use cases where you don't want this to be a unique field, then you don't have to make it a unique field. And also, I will say this, everything I'm doing in this video can be done 1,000 different ways. So everything I'm doing in DatoCMS, for example, and building out these models and building out the data structure in DatoCMS can be done a bunch of different ways. It doesn't have to be done exactly this way. So that is the kind of beauty and the curse of it. The beauty is we have quite a bit of freedom to develop and define the data as we want. But the curse is it can be pretty confusing and overwhelming sometimes, thinking, well, how do I accomplish this? What's the best way to accomplish this? So hopefully this video will become clearer in how you go about building out these models. Okay, so with that said, let's crack on with building out these models then. I'm building out the data structure in DatoCMS. We don't want any more validation rules here that I can think of. So the default value then we'll leave as blank. The presentation, let's select show as heading and hit save field. So now we've got our page title, which is a quick identifier for our page. The next thing I can think of, which again isn't anything visual in the page, is the page slug or the page URL. So if we go back to our page model, we want to add a new field. And looking at all these fields here, which one do you think we need to add a URL? You might be thinking, well, we need to add another text field, a single string text field. We could do that and add some regular expression validation with match a specific pattern. However, we're not going to do it that way because if we discard our changes here, let's add a new field, because DatoCMS comes built in with a slug field within the SEO field. So let's click on through to the SEO field type and we want to select slug, and the name, we're just going to call it slug. Validations, and this is one pet peeve I have with DatoCMS. You have to base the slug on a field where it'll be automatically generated. We can't just say, I want a slug and just be able to type in whatever slug I want. For some reason, DatoCMS requires that you base the slug on a title, base the slug on a different field within this page model. And that's not to say we can't actually change the slug, even though it's going to be automatically generated from the title. But again, for some reason, it's required that we base it on the title, base it on a different field in our model. So we're going to select the title to be basing the slug off. We want it to match a specific pattern of a web page slug. We can add a custom format if we want. So a custom regular expression, but we don't need to. We're going to use the built-in web page slug. It has to be required because every page has to have a slug. It has to be unique because obviously we can't have the same URL for two different pages. And we don't want to limit the character count, so we're not going to select that. The presentation, we can add a URL prefix here. So we're going to leave that blank because we don't actually have a site at the moment. So let's go ahead and save field. And at this point, let's just create a page so we know what creating a instance of a model looks like. So next we will go to actually create the sections and the columns, but let's actually create a page instance from here so we know what creating content actually looks like. So head on over to the Content tab in DatoCMS. We want to select Page, and we want to create a new record. And for the title, I'm just going to call it Homepage. And you can see the slug is automatically populating based on the value of the title field. And we don't want the slug to be homepage. We just want the slug to be blank. But remember, we said this field needed to be required, which is true, but we don't want any slug for the homepage. We just want it to be, for example, example.com. We don't want it to be example.com/homepage. So what I tend to do in my projects is I just call this index. So we can check in code then, anytime we're referencing an internal link of index, we just navigate to /. So it'll navigate to the root of our site. So let's hit save on this, and this will create then our first page instance. So we can see here we've got a list of pages. Obviously we just have one page. So we've got the home page, and this is an example of an instance of a model. So if we go back to the Visual Studio Code homepage then, we can see at the top here we also have a docs. So just so we get used to creating multiple pages and actually have something for our menu, our top navigation menu, let's go ahead and create another new page. Let's call it docs, and we'll keep it as docs for the slug and hit save. And go back to our content, our pages. We can see we've got pages, we've got our docs and our home page. So now then, before we start creating the grid columns, let's quickly create menu items. So first of all, we want to create a menu which will consist of multiple menu items. So in our models again, we want to go to settings, we want to go to models, and we want to create a new model called menu. Now, for the sake of this little demo, we're only ever going to have one menu. So we want this to be a single instance. So we're not going to have multiple menus. We're just going to have that top menu so we can make sure that this is a single instance. We can't create multiple menus. So let's go ahead and save model. Now, within the menu, if we go to the Visual Studio Code, obviously this is our menu here, and we have multiple menu items within a particular menu. So how do we go about this then in DatoCMS? We want menu items. So if we hit add new field, there's no such thing as menu items in here. These are all mostly primitive data types. So we've got string, boolean, number, etc., etc. We want a data structure that would be of type menu item, which we can define ourselves with things like the destination page for that menu item and the label text for that menu item. And they're probably the only two things we actually need. So the label text for the menu item and the destination page. So how do we go about that with these field types? Well, this is where we'd create either a new model, or because we're not going to reference these menu items anywhere outside of this singleton menu, then we can create something called a block. So defining a block is pretty much exactly the same as a model. So defining the structure of a block is the same as the structure of a model. So let's go ahead and create this block, and then we'll go back and look at the differences between a block and a model. So the block name, we want to give it a name of menu item. Let's hit save model, which is a little bit confusing actually. It should be save block, but there we are. So we've got a menu item block now, exactly the same as models. We can hit add new field. And for a particular menu item, what did we say we wanted? So we said we wanted a menu item label. So that is going to be a single text field. So let's go into the text field type, single line string, and let's call this label or label text. Validations, it must be required, and let's just leave everything like that. So let's hit save field. Now let's add another new field. So this is going to be the destination page. So for example, that's pretty obvious actually. I don't know why I'm giving you this example, but when we click through to docs, we want it to go to the docs page. So just like in DatoCMS, I'm not going to go back and show you, but remember we had the home page and the docs page. We want it to link to that particular docs page. Remember within DatoCMS as well, we specified the slug for that docs page. So it was /docs. So we want to be able to navigate to that docs page whenever we click on that menu item. So in the menu item block then, we want to create a destination field, and that is going to be of type link. So this is where we can link to different models within DatoCMS. So we want the menu item to only be able to link to a single page. So obviously we don't need multiple links because we're not going to link a single menu item to multiple pages. Where the multiple links will come in handy is if, for example, you have blog posts with multiple authors. So then we could link the multiple authors to a particular blog post. However, for menu items, they're only ever going to link to a single page. So we want it to be a single link, and let's call this destination. And for validations, we want to only specify or only accept specific models, and the model we want to accept is page. So we're setting up this destination field then to be able to link to a particular page. Obviously, we don't want to be able to link to a particular menu. That makes no sense. A menu item should only ever link to a particular page. So we just want to make sure that page is selected. And we need this to be required as well. So let's hit save field. And if we take note now, we've got a menu item block here. If we go to our content, we can see we can create a new menu because that is a model. We can create a new page because that is a model. However, that new menu item that we've just specified, because it's a block, we can't actually create a global instance of it within our dashboard. This is the special thing with blocks. So what we can do though is, if we go to settings and our models, for our menu, let's add a field for this menu and we're going to call it menu items. So this is going to be an array of menu items for this particular menu. Now this is the ideal situation where we'd want to use a block instead of a model because we want to reference. So for example, we just referenced for a particular menu item, we referenced a link to a global instance of a page within DatoCMS. So a menu item links to a particular instance of a page. However, a menu isn't going to link to particular global instances of a menu item because we want those menu items to be sandboxed within this menu. So for that, we can hit modular content and let's call this menu items. And for validations, we want to specify the allowed blocks for this field. So let's select menu item because menu item is the only block we've created so far. And we can limit the number of items, but we don't want to. We want to be able to freely select any number of menu items for this menu and hit save field. So now when we go to our content, for our menu, we can create a new menu item. And here is where we can see the data structure for that particular menu item. So this menu item here is a block. So it's almost like inline instances rather than globally accessible instances like models are. So blocks are inline instances and models are globally accessible instances. So when I create this menu item instance within this menu here, let's go ahead and just add a home label and the destination page will be home page. Let's add another new menu item, call the label docs and the destination will be docs. And we can collapse these if we want to. We can rearrange them within our menu, but we want it to be home first, then docs. And we hit save. So for this menu then, we've defined these two menu items. So we've got two instances of a menu item block in here. We can't access these instances anywhere else within DatoCMS. So for example, in the home page, if I wanted to say, right, I want to reference this particular menu item, we actually can't because it's inline, it's sandboxed into this menu. So that's the difference between blocks and models in DatoCMS. It can be a bit confusing at first, and also it can be confusing which one to use. If you want to use a block or a model for various data structures, it might not be immediately obvious, and it's not actually black and white when to use one or the other. And I would say this as well, don't spend too long thinking which one you should use because both will actually work. But this is just a rough guideline and a small example of when to use a block or a model. We could have used models here and that's absolutely fine and it would still work. That's the main thing I think to take note is it will still work if you use a block or a model. So hopefully you see the subtle difference between using a block and a model, an example of using one over the other. So from here then, I think a good place to go from here. Instead of, I know I said I'm going to look at the grid columns next, the sections and the grid columns next in DatoCMS, but I think I want to go and actually create the Gatsby project for this and link Gatsby to the DatoCMS data so we can start querying DatoCMS data from Gatsby. So let's go ahead and take a look at that next. So let's move on to the Gatsby portion then. Quickly before we do that though, within Gatsby, we query data using GraphQL. Now that's all set up in Gatsby for you. You don't have to set up your own GraphQL server or anything like that. So all we need to do is link our Gatsby project to our DatoCMS project, and we'll be able to query our data using GraphQL. Now, if you want to query the data quickly before setting up the Gatsby project, we can just head on to the API Explorer within DatoCMS and click on the Explorer button, and let's get rid of this query here. And we can see on the left-hand side, we've got all our GraphQL queries that are available to us. So obviously we've got all pages because we have multiple pages. So let's go ahead and query for all pages. Let's just query for the title and slug and hit play. And we can see we've got our docs page with the doc slug and our home page with the index slug. So our queries in Gatsby are going to look very similar to this. So let's go ahead then. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. So obviously before we create a new Gatsby project, we need to first install the Gatsby CLI. So head on over to gatsbyjs.com and hit Get Started and scroll down to this Get Started here for the framework. The URL for it is gatsbyjs.com/docs. And actually I was on the wrong page there. So you want to go into the docs and the setting up your development environment. So it's gatsbyjs.com/docs/tutorial/part-0. We don't really need to go to that URL. I could have easily just told you that the command to install the Gatsby CLI is npm install-g for global install Gatsby CLI. So obviously for that you need node and npm installed. I'm going to assume if you're watching this video, you probably already have those installed. So make sure you npm install-g Gatsby-CLI, and then in the terminal then, I've already got it installed, it's the Gatsby CLI installed. So to create a new Gatsby project, all we need to do is type Gatsby new and then the name of our Gatsby project. So I'm just going to call it VS Code, and it will clone from the default Gatsby starter into that new directory for you. So into the VS Code directory, and then I'm going to cd into that VS Code directory. Don't get confused with this directory being actual Visual Studio Code. This is the project, the Gatsby project that we're creating. So I'm going to cd into VS Code, and then I'm going to type code dot to open that in a new window. So this is our Gatsby project. Now, for the most part, you can think of Gatsby as just a React app, but with some opinions. So within this pages directory, for example, anytime we create a new file in the pages directory, then Gatsby will automatically create a root for us based on that file name. So for example, we already have a page-2 here. If we go open a new terminal and run Gatsby develop, that will start up a local server for us running the Gatsby project, and it will run it on localhost 8000. So let's go over to localhost 8000, and we've got a link here, go to page 2. We can see in the navbar here, we've got page-2. If we go to page-3, we can see we're getting a 404 error there. So if we create that then, let's just copy all the contents of page 2 in pages. Let's create a new file, page-3.js, and paste all of page 2's content into page 3. So then let's just call this third page. Hi from the third page. Welcome to page 3. And there we go, page 3 there. So let's save this and take a look in the browser now. If we refresh on page 3, now we've got hi from the third page. So Gatsby bases its roots. This isn't the only way we can create roots, but if we knew what pages and roots we needed, then adding them with the file name into pages will create that root for our site. So then how do we create dynamic roots? So dynamic meaning based on our data within DatoCMS. Obviously, we need a root which says localhost 8000/docs. And obviously we've got index here, but we're not going to be having /index. We want to render the home page for, if we go back to the home page, for the base URL here, instead of this hi people, etc., etc. So how do we do that within Gatsby? So if we go back to our code, within let's close all this. Within Gatsby Node, we can see we've already got an exports here to create pages. So this is a built-in Gatsby function, or it's a function that Gatsby is expecting that could be exported from Gatsby Node. So this isn't anything magical that's going on here. It's just that Gatsby is expecting that there may be an export called create pages from Gatsby Node. It's going to be a function, and so in that function then it's going to inject this particular property called actions, which, fun fact, is based on Redux. So it's a Redux action, although you don't really need to know that. And then we're going to call this action then. We're going to run this action on, so this particular action is called create page. So again, this is part of what Gatsby gives you for the create pages export for Gatsby Node. It gives you a create page action. So we can use that create page action then to dynamically create a page with the slug. For example, here in the default starter, it's creating a using DSG slug, and it's going to render this particular component in source templates using DSG for that particular page. So before we do anything then, let's actually go ahead to using DSG. Let's go localhost 8000 / using -DSG. And there we go. We can see hello from a DSG page. If we go to source templates, so exactly this path here, source templates using DSG. We can see source templates using DSG, hello from a DSG page. So this is the method we're going to be using for creating our pages based on DatoCMS data. However, first of all, we need to actually link our Gatsby project to DatoCMS. So I'm going to stop running Gatsby for a second here, and I'm going to install a Gatsby plugin called Gatsby Source DatoCMS. So we want to npm I gatsby-source-datocms. So once that's installed, we need to configure that plugin. So if we go to Gatsby config, within Gatsby config, we have an array of plugins for our particular Gatsby project. And this is where we need to set up the Gatsby Source DatoCMS plugin. So let's add a new entry in plugins. And one thing to note here is if our plugin doesn't need any setup, then we can just reference the plugin with a string or as a string. But if it requires some options or some configuration, then we can set up our plugin using an object with a resolve key and an options object. So the Gatsby Source DatoCMS plugin needs some configuration. So the configuration required is an API key to actually connect to our DatoCMS data. So let's create a new object for the plugins array. Let's resolve the plugin name, which is Gatsby-source-datocms, and we need to pass some options. So I'm going to head on over to the Gatsby Source DatoCMS documentation, and we can see we've got a how to use section here. So this is an example setup for the DatoCMS plugin, or the DatoCMS source plugin. So the first thing that we need is this API token. We can see here it's your read-only API token. We're going to grab that from DatoCMS in a second. But first of all, let's copy. Actually, we don't need to copy it. Let's just go back to our code. And in options, we need API token. Now in here, ideally, we want to reference the API token via an environment variable. So to do that, we need to set up environment variables for Gatsby. And if we head on over to the Gatsby documentation, we can see they've got a section on environment variables, and it comes built in with Gatsby. So all we need to do to be able to reference environment variables is add a require script at the top of our Gatsby config. So let's do that then. At the top of our Gatsby config, let's require.env, and we want to set up this configuration, which will take an object and a path property. And this is specifying the path for the environment variable file. So if we go to the documentation, they've got .env and then whichever node environment we're currently running the project in. If it's production, obviously it's going to be production. If it's development, then this will be .env.development. So let's go ahead then and add this little snippet in. So we want .env. and then process.env.node.env. So that means then we need to create a new file in our root directory called .env, or let's do that lowercase, .env.development. And this is where we can add our environment variables in. First of all though, let's go back to Gatsby config And I just want to note that if you're not that familiar with setting up environment variables, and you may be a bit confused about this configuration, let's just for a second remove this little snippet and instead add .env or .env.gim, for example. Then if our path is .env.gim in the configuration, we need to rename this, where is it? The .env.development. So this should be .env.gim. Obviously we don't want .env.gim. We want different, or potentially want different environment variables based on if we're running a development project or project in development or locally compared with a production running project. So that's why we've got this .env.process.env.node.env. So that's why we've named it .env.development, because when we're running our project locally, this process.env.node.env will return development. Okay, let's add our DatoCMS API token. So in Gatsby config, if we look at our Gatsby source DatoCMS, we need to add an API token here. So we're going to reference our environment variable here. We're going to add process.env.env. And then the name of the environment variable, we're going to call it DatoCMS underscore API underscore token. So let's copy this, add it to our .env.development, and we need to set this environment variable equal to our API token. So let's go back to our DatoCMS project. If we go to settings and go to API tokens, we want the read-only API token. Let's copy this API key, and back in our code then, for the DatoCMS API token, just paste it in for there. So save our environment variable file, let's save our Gatsby config, and from here we should be good to go. So let's hit Gatsby develop, and what we can do is head on over to localhost 8000 /___ GraphQL, and this will give us a very similar graphical tool that we saw in the API Explorer for DatoCMS. The queries are slightly different here. They've been mapped and renamed slightly, so for use in Gatsby. So we can see on the left-hand side, we've got our Query Explorer. What we want to do is query for all DatoCMS page. We want to query for nodes and title, slug, and original ID. Let's hit play, and there we go. We can see we've got our 2 pages returned locally from our Gatsby project based on the data we have in DatoCMS. So from here then, let's actually create these pages based on these slugs. So we want to create a docs page and a home page. So all we need to do is copy this query, the all DatoCMS page query, head on back to our code. So in Gatsby node, we want to, at the top here, we want to import GraphQL from Gatsby. Now this is going to let us run or execute GraphQL queries within our create pages function here. So I'm just going to leave this using DSG example here so we can refer to it. So what we want to do here then is query for all our DatoCMS pages. So underneath here then, let's go const result equals GraphQL, and we're going to call the GraphQL function with, I've accidentally copied the result. So we want to copy the query, not the result. So let's copy the all DatoCMS page query, if it will let me. Okay, let's copy all DatoCMS page query. We need to open a set of curly braces. Within those curly braces, paste in our query. And let's just console log result and see what that brings us. And in the console, it's saying we need to restart Gatsby develop to apply the changes for Gatsby node. And I'm getting an error here. Why am I getting an error? I'm a dum-dum. We don't require GraphQL from Gatsby here. Gatsby provides the GraphQL function for us for the create pages export in Gatsby node. So we can destructure GraphQL from here, not import it like I was doing just now like a dum-dum. We need to destructure it from the create pages function at the top here. So now, hopefully, if I rerun Gatsby develop, I'm not getting any errors, but this is going to return a promise. So we need to await this GraphQL call, and then it should work. We should see our console log result in our terminal here. Because remember, this is running in a node environment here. So it's running in a server setup rather than within the browser. So the console log is going to happen within our terminal here when we run Gatsby develop. And there we go. We can see here we've got our data, all DatoCMS page, and we've got an array of pages. So we need to access this data.allDatoCMS page.nodes to access each page. So we've got data, all DatoCMS page, nodes, and then we've got access to the slug and any other relevant information on a page within this result const. So let's loop over those then and run the create page function to dynamically create those pages. So if we go all DatoCMS page.nodes.for each. So for each page, we want to run the create page action, and let's copy this here and paste it into the create page. So we want the path to be page.slug, but the slug needs to be prefixed with a slash. So we want to go slash page.slug. But if page.slug is equal to index, we don't want to apply the index string to the page. We just want it to be slash. So we can put page.slug equals index, just return an empty string, else return page.slug. So for the component, let's create a new component in source templates, and let's call it generic page.js. We'll leave the context blank for now, and let's remove defer, and let's save this, but then we need to create this generic page in templates. So let's create a new file called generic-page.js. Let's import all as React from React. Let's export, actually it's a default export, so let's go const generic page equals, and let's just return an h1, oh not a j1, an h1 saying generic page, and let's export default generic page. So then if we rerun Gatsby develop and we head on over to localhost 8000, we should have now, if we go to /docs, we can see we're rendering generic page, but for the home page, we're still rendering this hi people page. And that is because if we go back to our code, go to pages, it's because we've specified an index.js in pages. If we simply remove this, I think we're going to need to rerun Gatsby develop because we changed the file system. So let's rerun Gatsby develop after having removed index.js from pages. And we should see again for the root URL of our site, we should see generic page. And it still wasn't working for me, and that is because if we go back to our terminal in VS Code, there was a caching issue, so it was still expecting that index.js file to be there, but obviously it wasn't. So to clear the cache in Gatsby is really simple. So this is actually a good segue into being able to clear the cache, which will resolve these types of issues in Gatsby. All we need to do is run Gatsby clean, and it will clear the cache in Gatsby, and then we can rerun Gatsby develop, and obviously you've got to spell it correctly, Gatsby develop. And now if we go back to localhost 8000, we can see for our homepage now, we're rendering that generic page. So what we want to do then is within our Gatsby node, so within our Gatsby node here, we want to be able to pass into this generic page component the ID of that particular page. So for example, when we render the generic page for the docs page, we want to render, or we want to pass into that page, we want to pass into the generic page component the ID for the docs page. When we render the generic page for the home page, we want to pass in the ID of the home page into the generic page component. So then from there, when we've got the IDs within the generic page component, we should have ID here or something similar to this. We'll have ID here, and we can query for this particular page and render the information specific to that page within our generic page. So let's remove this destructured ID here. This is really simple to do in Gatsby. Within Gatsby Node, any data we want to pass in as props to the generic page or to the component that we specify in the create page function. So in this example, it's the generic page. We just need to pass in the data to context. So for example, let's pass in ID here to the context, and we want to pass in page.originalID. Let's hit save on that, and back in the code, let's hit save on that. And for the generic page, let's just console log the props that we have now for the generic page, prefix that with props. And in Gatsby Node, let's rename this to page ID gym, so it's a bit more obvious when we console log it. So then let's rerun. Because we made changes to Gatsby Node, we usually need to rerun Gatsby develop again. So then from here, then if we open up our browser, localhost 8000, and refresh, we should see in the console here, let's zoom in a bit, we've got our props. Let's open that up, and in page context, we can see page ID gym, and that's the page ID for the home page. So if we go to our graphical tool, we can see all DatoCMS page, the ID of the home page. We can see matches, ends in 5537, and there we go, 5537. If we go to /docs, we can see we've got props, page context, page ID, ends in 5538. In our graphical tool, we can see ends in 5538 for the docs page. So from here then, we want to be able to query for that particular page and render the appropriate data for that page. So let's copy this ID then for the docs page, and in our graphical tool, what we can do is query for a particular page using GraphQL. So instead of using the all DatoCMS page, we're only going to be querying for a single page, so we can use the DatoCMS page query. Then all these purple highlighted properties here are things we can filter by, or things we can use to filter. So we want to query where original ID is equal to that string that we just copied, or the ID for the docs page that we just copied. And then let's query for the title, slug, and original ID. Let's hit play on that. And there we go. We've been returned the docs page. So all we need to do then is copy this query, and in our VS Code, back in the generic page component, what we can do in Gatsby is anytime we render a component for a page, like what we're doing here, we can export a GraphQL query, and the result of that GraphQL query will automatically inject the data as props for this particular component. So let's go ahead and export a const query, set that equal to GraphQL, and we need to import GraphQL at the top here from Gatsby. So let's add our GraphQL query in a set of backticks here. Let's paste in the DatoCMS page query. However, we need to prefix this query with the word query in GraphQL, and we need to name the query. So let's call it page query. And what Gatsby has done is, because in Gatsby Node, because we've passed down page ID gym into the context for this particular component, this variable will also be accessible within any GraphQL queries that we export from this page component. So to access that variable then, we can access it from this page query parameters, and in GraphQL, for variables, we just prefix them with the $. So this variable's name is going to be exactly the same name as what we used for the context. So it's going to be page ID gym. I've just copied it there, going to paste it there. Page ID gym. We need to specify a type for this variable. So the type is of type string. So instead of this hard-coded original ID in here, we just use that page ID gym. Remember, prefix it with the $. And now if we save this, and we're still console logging our props. So if we go back to the browser to localhost 8000 and refresh the page, in our props now, if we open up our props, we can see we have a data object here. Within the data object, we have DatoCMS page and all the data that we need for this particular page. So we can access this data then. Let's go ahead and do it now then actually. So in the H1, let's just go props.data.datocms page.title. Let's hit save on that, and obviously we need to render it. We want to render this, so we need to wrap it in curly braces. So let's take a look in the browser, and there we go. We're rendering generic page docs. If we went to the home page, we can see generic page homepage. So from here then, let's set up a quick menu. It's not going to be anything pretty, but we're going to set up a quick menu so we can link between each of our pages using our data. If we go back to the graphical tool, using our data in the DatoCMS menu, querying for the menu items, and we want the label text, the original ID and destination. And for the destination, remember the destination is of type page. So we need to query for the destination slug. And if we hit play on this, we can see we've got our two menu items. The first one navigating to the home page, the second one navigating to the docs page. So from here then, let's go ahead and render these menu items. So what we can do, exactly like before, we can copy this GraphQL query. Let's head on back to our code. And if you noticed before with page 2 and page 3, actually let's navigate to page 2 and page 3 now. So if we go localhost 8000/page 2, and we can see we've got a header here with the Gatsby default starter. If we go to page 3, exactly the same. So this looks like it's a layout component rendered for all pages, and then we're rendering the content underneath the header. So if we go back to our code, we can see in page 2 and page 3, we can see we're actually rendering a layout component then. So that's defined in components and layout. Let's go to source components, layout.js. And we can see we're rendering this header here, and that's been imported from exactly the same directory, so components and header. So within this header component then, we can see we're rendering an H1 with site title being passed in as a prop to the header. But in here, what we want to do is query for, if we go back to graphical, we want to query for our menu items and render them at the top here in this purple section for all of our pages. So first of all, we need to wrap the generic page content in that layout component. So let's import at the top here, import layout from components/layout. And let's wrap our content here. Let's wrap the H1. So layout here, wrap in the H1. So if we save this and take a look in the browser now, let's go to docs. So there we go. We can see we're rendering the generic page with the layout component. So we want to switch this layout component up then. We want to, or the header component actually. So in our code then in header.js, we want to query for all our menu items. Now we can't export a query in header.js like we did in the generic page.js. We can only export queries for page components. That is, components that are rendered for a particular page. So any child components within that page cannot export a query. This query export here is known as a page query. So we need a different type of query in this header.js. So this is where the static query comes in from Gatsby. So it works very similar to the page query, except it's a static query, which means we can't inject any variables into that query. For example, for the page query, we were able to inject this page ID gym. Should probably rename that actually to something more appropriate. But we were able to inject this page ID gym variable into the page query. We can't do that with static queries. However, we don't need a variable for this static query because we only have one menu. And even if we had multiple menus, we'd be able to differentiate this menu because it would be the header menu, for example. So let's go ahead and use that static query then. So at the top here from Gatsby, we also want to import use static query. Then let's switch this up a bit. Let's tidy it up and add a return statement for this header. Then within the function body then, we can go const result equals use static query. And we want to pass in GraphQL. So GraphQL also needs to be imported from Gatsby at the top here. And within backticks, again, let's just paste. Oh, I've copied the wrong thing. So in graphical, Let's copy that DatoCMS menu query. Let's paste it in the backticks. And let's console log the menu result. So let's add result here. Let's check in the browser now for docs. Let's open up the console. We've got menu results here. We've got DatoCMS menu, menu items, and our 2 menu items. Let's zoom in a bit there actually. So we can see our 2 menu items there. So let's actually render that then in our code. Let's remove this H1 and let's render then our our result.datocms menu.menuitems.map. So for each menu item, we want to return, let's just for now return a div, and the key will be menu item.original ID. I think that's what we queried for. If we go at the top here, yeah, we got menu item original ID. And let's render the menu item.label text. So let's take a look in the browser and see what that looks like. Great, so we've got home and docs. Now what we want to do is link to these particular pages. So instead of an anchor tag, for example, we might have an anchor tag here with an href. Gatsby provides to us a link component for any internal linking to our site. So if it was an external link, we wouldn't use the Gatsby internal link component. However, we're linking to internal pages of our site. So we want to use this link component imported from Gatsby. Now, one of the major advantages of using this link component from Gatsby is if we have a page that renders a bunch of these link components, then Gatsby will go ahead and prefetch those pages. If the user was then to click on any of those links, the page is already prefetched from the server. We don't have to waste time, even the small amount of time, hitting a server to retrieve a static file or a static page. Gatsby's already prefetched it for us, so it loads instantly. So that's one of the things that makes Gatsby sites even faster, is things like this, things like prefetching internal pages for our site. So we're going to want to use this link component anytime we want to link to a particular internal page. So instead of that div then, let's render the link component, and link components take a to-prop. So this is the URL to navigate to. And again, this has to be an internal link. It won't work if we have HTTPS here with google.co.uk. We can't do that. What we can do though is link to an internal page using / and then menu item.slug. So if we take a look in the browser now, we've got home and docs. Let's navigate to docs, and I'm getting an error here because we've navigated to undefined apparently. If I check my code again, I don't know if you've already figured it out, but it shouldn't be menu item.slug. It should be, if we check out the console log, it should be menu item.destination.slug. So let's go menu item.destination.slug and take a look in the browser. If we go back to that previous page, well, we're already on the docs page. So actually, let's go to our home page and then navigate to our docs page. We can see we've navigated to the generic docs page. But what happens if we try and navigate to home? Remember, this slug is index, and we don't have a page called index. So what we can do here is create our own wrapper for the link component. So let's go components and add a new file and call it link.js. And we want to import the link from Gatsby. And we want to import this link as Gatsby link because we're going to create a const link here. So this is our own implementation of the link. And we're going to expect a to-prop just like the Gatsby link does. And let's return the Gatsby link. And we want to render any children within that Gatsby link then. So let's render children in here. And for the to-prop, instead of just passing down the to-prop like this, we want to check to see if 2 is equal to index. If 2 is equal to index, then we want to render just /, so it'll take us to the home page. Else, we want to render / and 2. So because DatoCMS slugs don't come with a prefix /, we're just prefixing it here so we don't have to pass it in as the to-prop. So let's save this file then, and we want to export default link. So let's save the file. We want to import this link component then in the header. Instead of the link component in Gatsby or coming from Gatsby, we want to import link from link here. So this is our own implementation. And I'm getting an error in the console here because I forgot to import React in the link component. So let's import React at the top here as well from React. Let's save that, and that takes care of that error. So in our header.js then, we want to import link from our own link implementation. And instead of prefixing it with a slash here, let's just pass in menuitem.destination.slug. Let's save this and check it out in the browser now. If we go back to our home page, let's go to docs. We can see we're on the docs. Let's go to home. We can see we've navigated to our home page. So from here now then, let's take a look again at the Visual Studio Code site. This is the section of the video now that I'm going to cover creating sections and grids. So to do that, we need to create some new models and blocks in DatoCMS. So let's head on back to our DatoCMS and let's create a new block. So this new block is going to be a section block, and a section can contain any number of grid columns. So let's go back to DatoCMS. In settings then, let's create a new block in our blocks library. Let's hit add new, and we want to call this section. So let's save model. Now, if we take a look in Visual Studio Code, we could customize this section very extensively if we wanted to. If we wanted to give the content creators the option, for example, to add a dark background for this section. For example, most hero sections usually have a dark background, or some hero sections even have background images. So this entire hero could have a background image. However, we're not going to add that much customization to it. We're just going to allow the section to render multiple grid columns. So if we scroll down again, so we could say that this is a dark background for a section, then this could be the light background. This could be a muted background for a section. So these three things here are each a section with a different background color. Obviously, we've identified three different colors there. We've got this dark gray, we've got the white, and we've got the light gray. However, like I said, I'm not going to go into that much customization for our section because we could be here all day. So we just want to specify columns for a section in our example. So in section then, we want to add a new field, and it's going to be modular content, and this is going to be grid columns. So let's hit save field on this for now, and from here we need to actually create a grid column block. So let's hit add new again. Let's create a grid column, save model. And again, grid columns can contain all sorts of different subcomponents. For example, a call to action. We've got some H1s. We've got some heading text. We've got some paragraph text. We've got this little banner here. So we could break these down into even smaller components. For example, banner, call to action components, and define those within DatoCMS depending on what your needs are for a particular landing page. However, again, I'm not going to drill down into too much detail. I'm just going to add some content and maybe a background image, or not a background image, but an image for a column. So let's go ahead and add some data then for our grid columns. Let's go ahead and add a new field, and we want a structured text field for this. So this is just going to simply be called content, validations. We might want it to be required. I'm just going to leave that blank for now though. Presentation. These are all the allowed blocks that you can use. You can restrict it if you want, but I'm just going to keep everything selected there just for this example. Obviously, depending on your needs, you'll know if you'll need any of these or not. However, let's just keep it as the default settings for now and hit save. So back in our section then, we need to add some validation rules for these grid columns. And actually, I've forgotten. So for a grid column, we need to specify the width that they span within the section for various screen sizes. Now, to keep things simple, we're just going to go mobile, tablet, and desktop. Again, this can be accomplished in many different ways. However, I'm going to specify 3 new values on the grid column, and it's going to be a number and it's going to be an integer number, and I'm going to specify, or I'm going to name each of these three fields. So the first one will be desktop width, and the validations is required. The range we want to set between minimum 0 and maximum 100. So we're going to add a rule that if the grid column width is 0, then we just hide that grid column for that particular screen size. So default value, let's insert the default value as 100. And the presentation, let's add some help text here for our content creators and just notify them that this value is a percentage width. Let's add a label, something like value must be specified as a %, and let's hit save field. And what we can do here, instead of going add new field and a new integer number, etc., for the tablet and mobile widths, what we can do is just select the options here and duplicate, and let's edit this field. We want this one to be tablet width, and again here tablet underscore width, and the validations, default value, etc. Let's keep all those the same. And again, let's duplicate this one, edit the field. So this one will be mobile width. So again, we need the field ID to be mobile underscore width, save field. From here then, we need to actually allow a page to render a section. So in our models then, or actually, first of all, in our blocks, we need the section for the grid columns. Let's hit edit field here. We need to add some validation here. So we need to specify that it's only a grid column that's allowed to be specified for the grid columns. So only the grid column block can be specified in our section grid columns. Obviously, in our section grid columns, we don't want the content creators to be able to select a menu item or another section. We just want them to be able to select grid columns. So we're restricting it to grid columns. So now then from here, we need to go back to our models and our page. And it's within here then, we need to add a new field. Again, we're going to select modular content, and we're going to add something like sections. So we're going to be constructing our pages based on all these different sections. So we've got this hero section, we've got this, I don't know what section you'd call this, but feature links section, because these are different features for VS Code, I guess. We've got testimonials section, we've got the IntelliSense feature section, we've got print statement debugging section, git commands section, etc., etc. So you can see this page is divided into all these different sections. We're going to name that in DatoCMS. Seems like a reasonable field name to call this section or call this field is sections. So for validations, we want to specify the allowed blocks. Obviously, we only want to allow sections, and let's hit save field. So let's go back to our content then. And for a page, we want to go to the home page. So now we can see we've got this sections section in a page. So we can start constructing our page with these new sections and with these grid columns. So the first grid column, we need to wait for a bit there for the content to load, for the rich text editor to load. So for Visual Studio Code, let's go back to the website for VS Code. So we're going to add an H1 here. So let's go / heading 1, and the heading 1 value is going to be, what is it? Code editing. So code editing, and then underneath here, let's just put a heading 2, just so we've got some variation, and it's going to be redefined. So redefined. Then we've got some paragraph text, free, built on open source, runs everywhere. I'm just going to copy that underneath here, paste it underneath there. So the desktop width is, I'm going to say roughly, this is probably 30%, and then this is the remaining 70%. So that the 30% might be a bit too narrow, but for this example, let's just put 30%. For the tablet width, let's go 50%, and mobile width is 100%. So that is our first grid column. So this is our first grid column. You can add more data in there if you want, but I'm just going to keep it as that, keep it simple for now. And then let's add our second grid column then. So we need a second grid column, and you'll notice here, if we go /, there's no such thing as an image, but we want to add an image for this particular grid column. So for now, let's just save this, And let's go back to our settings and let's create an image block. So if you know you're going to use images multiple times throughout your site, or sorry, the same image multiple times throughout your site, you might want to consider creating a model for images so you can always link to a specific image instance whenever you want to render an image. Or if you just want to render a one-off image, then a block would be more suitable. However, if you think, well, there's some cases where I'll probably want to use the same image multiple times. However, I don't want to create an instance every time I want to render an image, because there's going to be some cases where I just want to render one inline and not have to create an instance of it. I just want to create the instance within the sandbox of that grid column. So there's nothing stopping you creating a model and calling that image, and then in your blocks library, create a block called image inline or something like that. So then if you want to, you have then the reference to an image instance. If you wanted to reference an image instance, you can using the model, or if you wanted to create an inline one, just use the image inline block. So I'm going to go with the inline method, and for this I'm just going to add a new field and a media field. It's going to be a single asset, and the field name is going to be image, and validations going to be required. We want to accept only specified extensions, and we're going to select image, and let's hit save field. So now then in our grid columns, we want to add for our content, let's edit this field. For the validations, we want to allow users or content creators to be able to specify and add this image inline within a grid column or within a grid column's content. So in the validations tab then, we can select here for the blocks allowed, we can select this image inline. Let's hit save field. So now then, if we go back to our content, for the home page, for this second grid column then, now if we hit /, we can add an image inline block. And this presents us with the uploader, and we can select from our gallery if we wanted to. I'm just going to print screen this image and upload it to my DatoCMS gallery. So I'm going to hit upload new and select the image and wait for it to upload. And for this grid column then, we want to specify the width as 60% for desktop. So that will equal 100% there. Sorry, that doesn't equal 100%, that equals 90%. So the first column is 30% for desktop. So we want the second column to be 70%. We could have it as 60% if we wanted to, but it would mean that the column would end here and the two columns wouldn't span the full width of our screen. In DatoCMS then, we want the desktop width to be 70% for the second column. For the tablet width, we've got 50% for the first column, so let's put 50% for the second column. And the mobile width we want to be 100%, which means both these columns would stack. Just like in the Visual Studio Code website, we've got a width of 100% here and a width of 100% here. So let's go ahead and save this then. And from here, now that we've got our first section on our homepage with our grid columns, let's actually query within Gatsby for our grid columns and actually render them. So before we start, just like before, a good place to start building out our Gatsby GraphQL query is within the Graphql tool. Now, because our data has changed, you may need to stop the currently running server for Gatsby with Control-C in the terminal and rerun Gatsby develop, just so Gatsby picks up that new data that we've added in DatoCMS. So once that's done, head on over to localhost 8000 __ GraphQL. And we want to query for all DatoCMS page. We want to query for nodes. We want to query for sections. We want to query for the original ID and the grid columns. And within the grid columns, we want to know the tablet width, mobile width, and desktop width, as well as obviously the content for those columns. Now, within the content, we can see we have three things we can query here. We can query for the value, links, and blocks. DatoCMS's structured text structure is something called DAST. So DAST stands for the DatoCMS Abstract Syntax Tree. And if we scroll down a bit further, we can see that this is what Dast looks like. So to be able to render this then by ourselves is going to be pretty time consuming. We've got to set up all different rules and things to be able to render a heading, for example, and paragraph text, just like we have in our section grid columns. We have heading 1, heading 2, and paragraph text. So based on this type of data structure, it's going to be quite difficult and time consuming to implement that ourselves. But luckily, DatoCMS has a React component for us that we can use called structured text. So if we go to github.com, DatoCMS structured text, we can see here we've got a structured text component that we can import from the DatoCMS structured text. So we're going to install this in a second, but I want to continue with our GraphQL query. So in our content, we have links, and the links refer to, if we go back to our content, the links refer to, so this is our content here. If we type /, we can see all the available things we can render within this content block. So we can add an inline image or an image inline block, and not just blocks, we can also reference instances of models. So this is what this links is referring to, is if we had any instances of models that we want to render within our content. However, we've set up rules to only allow the image inline block. So we don't have any rules for this content to be able to render or link to an instance of a model. So that's why we can see this links doesn't have any properties that we can query on it, because we don't have any rules to allow any links within content to be rendered. But we do have blocks because we have this image inline block. So it's potential. So we potentially have a image in a content block. And one thing to note here is we might not necessarily have just an image inline block. We might set up other blocks that we want to be able to render within the content. For example, a call to action block. So we need to query all of these different blocks that we need to render within content. So in the blocks property then, because we only have one block available, we can directly query for the image on an image inline. So first of all, let's just query for the type name of a particular block. So let's open up, we're going to have to do this manually. So let's open up a set of curly braces and type __ type name. And let's just hit play on this. And we can see we've got our grid columns, and within our content, we have the Dast schema, and we have all this data here. So we want to look at our second grid column with the inline image block. So to query the inline image or the image inline block, because we only have one block available to the content, we can query it directly in here. So we can query for the image. However, this is not such a good practice, because in reality, we're going to have multiple blocks, or potentially have multiple blocks within our content, which means not all of the data associated with a block will be stuffed into directly being able to query on this blocks. So if that sounds confusing, don't worry. All you need to do is just change the query slightly. So you want to query on ... on DatoCMS image inline. And on this DatoCMS image inline, this is where we query for the image. And within Gatsby, we have a special Gatsby image component which we can use, which is just an optimized image component. So that comes out of the box with Gatsby source DatoCMS. So it sets all up the image optimization queries and things for us. So we can just query for Gatsby image data on image. Now, if we wanted to also query the data for example, a call to action button. Let's say we had available in this content that we've set up a call to action block. Then all we need to do is query for ... on DatoCMS call to action. And then and that needs to be curly braces, and then any properties that we want to query on this DatoCMS call to action. Obviously, we just have the inline image, or the image inline. I keep getting that wrong. So we just have the image inline. So let's hit play on this. And we can see if we scroll down, we have our blocks. We have our type name of DatoCMS image inline, and the image property with the Gatsby image data and all the information that the Gatsby image component that we're going to use requires to render a optimized image for us. So from here then, all we need to do is select this sections section of our GraphQL query. Let's copy it and head on back to our code. And for our DatoCMS page, we just need to paste that sections query in for that page query, because remember, we're querying sections on a particular page and we're console logging the props on our generic page. So let's go back to the browser. Let's go to localhost 8000, and actually we just need to navigate to localhost 8000, just to the home page. Let's take a look at our props. We need to go DatoCMS page, sections, and within the sections we can see we have just one section with two grid columns. The first grid column, we can see we've got our widths, we've got our content, and we've got our data associated with that content. Let's go to the second column and open up the blocks, and we can see we've got our DatoCMS image inline, and up here we have the HTML markup in dast format. If we keep on navigating down the tree, we've got a heading 1, heading 2, and paragraph text. So to render this then, we need to use the structured text component from DatoCMS. So let's go ahead and install that now back in our code. Let's stop running Gatsby with Control-C. And the package we want to install is react-datocms. So let's npm I react-datocms. And once that's installed, let's create 3 new components. Actually, we'll start off with the first component, which is the section component. So for the section component, we're just gonna, if we take a look at the VS Code site again, we're just gonna make the section component full width. We're gonna make the content a max width of, let's say, 1200 pixels. We're just gonna roughly do this. We're not gonna copy the VS Code site exactly. We're just gonna do 1200 pixels, centrally aligned within the container or the wrapper. And then within that section component, we'll create a second component called grid column, and these are the grid column components. And then within the grid column component, that's where we're going to render the structured text component to render our content. So in our code then, within our components, let's create a new component called section.js. Let's import React from React. Let's do a default export. So let's go const section equals return, let's just return hard-coded section string for now, export default section, and the props we want to pass to a section is the grid columns. So first of all, within our pages, our template generic page, on this props we have access to, if we rerun Gatsby develop, on this props we have access to props.data.datocms page.sections. So let's loop over those sections and return or render a section component. So let's go props.data.datocms page.sections.map. So for each section, we're going to render that section component, which means we need to import that section component then from components/section. And the key for each section will be section.original ID. And let's make sure we're querying for that original ID on the sections. So there we go, we've got sections, original ID. So this is where this props.data.datocms page.sections is coming from. So we've got props, data, datacms page, datacms page, sections, mapping over each section. And as part of each section, we have grid columns. So let's also pass in, or let's actually pass in then the grid columns to this particular section. So it's going to be section.grid columns. And are we querying for the ID as well on the grid columns? I don't think we are. So we also need to query for original ID on the grid columns. So within our section component then, let's destructure grid columns. And for now, let's just put grid columns.length. just so we got something on the screen and we can see it actually working. And we're on the home page. If we refresh localhost 8000, we can see we've got 2 columns for our section. So first of all, let's add a little bit of styling for our section. And it seems that we've got some global styles actually already centrally aligning this on the screen. So I'm going to remove that. So in layout.css, let's take a look. This is all reset CSS. So it's probably somewhere else. Let's go to layout.js. And there we go. We can see in layout.js, it's inline. So we can strip all of this out actually. So let's take a look in the browser now. There we go. So we want, let's actually copy that value. So the max width was 960. Let's just go with that. Let's go max width for 960 for our sections. So let's create a new section.css file. And we're just going to have a section and a section inner. So the section is going to be width 100%. The section inner is going to be max width 960, width 100%, and margin 0 on the top and bottom, auto on the left and right. So let's add those class names then to section.js. Let's import section.css. We've got our class name section here, and let's render this content within another div. And this div here will have a class name of section inner. So let's take a look now in the browser, and there we go. We can see the section has shifted across. The whole section is max width 100%, but the inner is max width 960. And we can see this isn't being moved across because in our page, our generic page, this isn't part of the section. This H1 isn't part of the section. So we don't have any styling to centrally align that. I don't really care about that for now. Let's just skip past that and let's just concentrate on the sections. So for the section then, we want to render columns for each column. For each grid column, we want to render a new column component. So in components, let's go ahead and create that grid column component. So grid column.js, import React from React. Let's const grid column. And again, let's just return a div with grid col. Export default grid column. And in section then, we need to import that grid column from grid column and map over each of our grid columns here. So let's go grid columns.map. So for each grid col, let's just return a grid column. The key will be grid col.original ID. And obviously we need to pass the content for this grid column. So if we go back to our page query in generic page and scroll down to our query, so the content is called exactly that. So we've named our content field content. So for each grid column, we need to pass in the content and our widths. So let's go ahead and do that then. For our section within the grid column, we need to pass down as props the mobile width. So that is going to be equal to grid col.mobile width. Exactly the same for tablet width. We want grid col.tablet width, and desktop width, we want grid col.desktop width, and save that. And we need to pass the content, which is grid col.content. So for these to be able to behave like grid columns, we need to add some extra styling for the section inner. So these grid columns are displayed in line, or potentially displayed in line. Some of them might stack at 100 width, but potentially, or more than likely, they'll be in line. So in our section.css then, we just want to add display flex to the section inner. And for our grid col then, we want to destructure all those properties that we just passed down. So mobile width, desktop width, tablet width, and content. So from here, we need to render our different widths for different screen sizes. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can do this, and this is why I really like working with styled components, because we could just pass in each of those widths and create dynamic classes and styles for those different media queries. However, I'm going to stick with plain CSS for this, and it's not going to be the prettiest solution to accomplish this. However, it's going to look fairly straightforward, and it's probably going to be the easiest way to demonstrate it. So if we add a fragment, wrap the first grid column in a fragment, or the grid column in a fragment, remember this is just one grid column. Let's just repeat this twice. So the first one is going to be mobile, second desktop, and third tablet. So let's put desktop, tablet grid call, and mobile grid call. Let's add a style. So the width is going to be the desktop width, and we're going to add % on the end of that, because remember this is just an integer and we need it to represent a percentage width. Exactly the same for the tablet. So width is going to be tablet width and %, and we have style width for the mobile width and add % at the end of that one. So let's add a class name then for the desktop one. So we've got grid call desktop, and we could change this to small, medium, and large screens, but I'm just going to stick with what we've got here. So we've got desktop, tablet, and mobile. And actually, small, medium, and large is probably a better thing to name all of these, even in DatoCMS, rather than desktop, tablet, and mobile. However, I'd say more the general public actually refer to screen sizes as desktop, tablet, and mobile rather than small, medium, and large. So it gives content creators an idea as well of what it's going to look like on mobile, desktop, and tablet. That doesn't really give an idea of what screens are going to appear where, etc., etc. But feel free, if you think this naming convention is shit, then just name it small, medium, and large. That's fine. But I'm going to go with mobile, desktop, and tablet. So in components then, let's create some styles for these then. So let's go grid column.css. So we've got our grid col desktop, and we need two more. So for mobile and tablet. So tablet, mobile, and for each grid call, let's give them all a common class name of grid call. So then by default, we're going to have our grid calls display none. And then let's add some media queries then. So media min width, let's say 1200 pixels, and above is the desktop. So let's chuck that grid call desktop in there. And we want to display block. Let's add another media query then of max width 1199 pixels and min width 768 pixels. So this is going to be our tablet view, and we want the grid call tablet to be display block, and the same then for our mobile view. However, it's going to be a max width of 767. So let's go max width 767. Grid call mobile is display block. Let's save that. And at the top of grid column.js, let's make sure we import that style sheet then. So grid column.css, and save this. And then if we take a look in the browser, this should work. So if I expand my screen, we can see we've got desktop grid calls. So that is 30 and 70. If we go down to tablet, we can see we've got 50 and 50. If we go down to mobile, however, it looks like we've still got 50 and 50, even though we've got a width of 100% for the grid call mobile. And that is because we need to add a flex wrap to this section inner. So in our section, let's go to section.css for section inner. Let's go flex wrap of wrap. Save that and take a look in the browser now. And there we go. We can see we've got our stacked mobile columns. So up again to the tablet, we can see 50-50, and up to desktop, we can see 30-70. Now the 1200 for mobile screens seems a little bit too high. Oh, sorry, for tablet screens, or the tablet and desktop breakpoint seems a bit too high. I think it's probably best, or it would be best if we brought this down to maybe 1100 or 1092, something like that. However, you get the gist of it. I'm going to leave it like that. So the next stage we need to do now then is actually render our content within these grid calls. So this is where we use the structured text component from DatoCMS. So I tend to wrap the structured text component in my own component because it contains a lot of common configuration that we're going to use anytime we use the structured text component. So with that said, I'm going to create a new file called contentrenderer.js, and let's import React from React. Let's import the structured text component from React DatoCMS. Let's go const content renderer equals a React component. For now, let's just return content renderer and export default content renderer. And let's use this structured text then within our div here. Let's just render the structured text, and we need to pass props to this structured text. So the first thing is this React DatoCMS structured text component knows how to render the Dast schema. So for example, headings, paragraph, text, that's absolutely fine. It knows how to render those types of things. So all we need to do to pass that in then is let's destructure a content prop from content renderer, pass in data to the structured text, and let's render this content renderer passing in our content for each grid column. So our content is not going to change anytime we render it if it's desktop, tablet, or mobile grid calls. So let's create a const up here then and call it content renderer, or content rendered maybe, and set that equal to content renderer, passing in the content that's been passed into the grid call down to the content for the content renderer. We need to import that content renderer component from components/content renderer. Render this content renderer then, or the content rendered, within each grid call. Again, this isn't the best way of accomplishing this with the grid calls. However, it's the cleanest way I can think of, just using plain CSS. So let's go ahead then and check in our browser. Seems we're getting an error here, and that is because the structured text document contains a block node, but no render block prop is specified. So if you've guessed that this block node is actually the DatoCMS image inline block, then you've guessed correctly. And what it's essentially saying is, when we're trying to render this structured text, it's saying we've found a DatoCMS inline image, a DatoCMS image inline block, but you've not said how to render this. So that's why it's throwing that error. So to render this then, for the structured text component, we pass down a prop called render block, and this render block is going to be passed a callback function, and the arguments to this callback function is going to be record. So for now, let's just console log this record to see what we get. And it seems like we're getting another error here, which means our query is slightly off. So if we go to templates, generic page, and we can see here we're querying for the DatoCMS image inline. However, the error is saying that we can't find a record with ID and then the ID of that record inside data.blocks. And that is because we're not actually querying for the ID. So here we need to query for the ID for this particular block, but we want to map the original ID to a property called ID. So the structured text render block is looking for the original ID. However, we need to map it to a property called ID, and that is super easy in GraphQL. All we need to do is type ID :original ID, and this original ID property will be mapped to this new ID property in our return data. So for example, let's say we needed a property called ID gym, but we needed it to be equal to the value of original ID. So that's super easy. All we need to do is type ID gym :original ID. So this original ID value will be set to ID gym, and ID gym will be returned to us as part of our data for this query. So obviously we don't need ID gym, we need ID, and it needs to be equal to this original ID. If we go back to the browser now, we might need to refresh, but we can see here we've got our code editing redefined. la 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 li 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 with our paragraph text. So the second thing we need to do now then is render that image component. So the Gatsby image component should already be installed as part of the boilerplate project when we created our project. But if not, all you need to do is type npm i gatsby-plugin-image, and that will install the Gatsby image component. Then what you need to do is go to Gatsby config and make sure the Gatsby plugin image is part of your plugins array. And you can just reference it as a string because there's no need to add any options or configuration for this plugin. So once that is done, in our structured text component within our content renderer, we want to render the Gatsby image component for this DatoCMS image inline block. So let's return the Gatsby image component, and that's imported it from the wrong place. It should just be Gatsby plugin image. So let's get rid of that. So Gatsby image from Gatsby plugin image, need to render the Gatsby image and need to set an image prop, and that's going to be equal to record dot, and I've forgotten what we've got on record here. So we've console logged it here in render block. Let's take a look in the console. We can see we've got record.image.gatsby image data. So it's this Gatsby image data that we need to pass to the Gatsby image component. And actually we need to destructure record from that first argument in the render block callback. And I've made a slight mistake here. We don't actually just want to return the Gatsby image component. We want to check to see if the current block we're rendering is equal to type DatoCMS image inline. Because remember, for example, if we had a call to action block that we wanted to render, we don't want to render the Gatsby image component for the call to action block. We want to render a call to action component for the call to action block. So we want to check to see if record.__type name is equal to DatoCMS image inline. If it is, then we return the Gatsby image component, passing in record.image.gatsby image data. And if not, we can just return null. So now let's take a look in the browser, and there we go. We can see we're rendering our image, and there we go. We're rendering our two columns. We go down in size to the tablet width. We've got 50 and 50 widths. Into the mobile view then, we've got 100 width and 100 width. So I think I'm going to end the tutorial here. I've got a bunch of different courses around Gatsby. If you want to check those out, I'll leave a link in the description below with a coupon code where you can pick those courses up for under $10. So you've got a wealth of knowledge there around Gatsby. I've got Gatsby with Firebase, Gatsby with WordPress, Gatsby with Contentful, Gatsby with Shopify, Gatsby with Prismic. I've got a bunch of Gatsby courses as well as style components. So I'll leave a link in the description below to my site where you can pick those up at a discount price. And if you want me to continue and build upon this particular example, just drop a comment below. And if you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. I'm going to end it here for this one, and I will see you in the next video.